You know that face, right? It's on t-shirts, posters, murals, pretty much everywhere. It's Ernesto Che Guevara. But behind that famous image is a story that is just packed with contradictions. So today, we're going to dive into the man behind the myth, a guy who some see as a revolutionary hero and others condemn as a pretty brutal executioner.
So those were his last words. October 9th, 1967, he's facing down a Bolivian soldier who has orders to execute him. And in that moment, the man died, sure, but a legend was born. He became a martyr for a cause that would go on to outlive him by decades. But what exactly was that cause, and what was the real cost of his revolution?
And this is the real puzzle, isn't it? How can one person be a symbol of liberation and a face of terror at the same time? To some, he's a freedom fighter who stood up to empires. To others, he's the guy who oversaw executions and set up forced labor camps. So let's try to unpack this incredibly complex legacy.
Okay, so to get the revolutionary, first you have to understand the man he was before the fight. See, his journey didn't start with a rifle in his hands. It actually started with a stethoscope and a really, really curious mind.
Now, what's so fascinating here is the sheer contrast. You might think of a revolutionary as someone who grew up with nothing, but Ernesto was born into a privileged, upper-middle-class family in Argentina. He was a total bookworm. His family's library had something like 3,000 books, and he read everything from poetry to the political theories of Marx and Lenin. And get this, despite suffering from crippling asthma his whole life, he pushed his body to the absolute limit. He became a fierce rugby player. It just shows you right from the start, he had this intense intellect and an equally intense will to match.
So while he was studying to be a doctor, his whole worldview got completely turned upside down. In 1952, he and a friend took off on this epic 8,000-mile motorcycle journey all across Latin America. And it was on this trip that the comfortable world he knew just collided with a much harsher reality. He saw it all firsthand, the crushing poverty, the exploitation of workers in the mines, and the deep, deep social injustices that were just scarring the continent. And he wrote it all down.
That journey basically changed everything. He came to a realization. He thought, what's the point of treating one person's sickness when the entire society is sick? His focus shifted. He went from wanting to cure individuals to wanting to overthrow the entire system, capitalism, which he now believed was the root cause of all the suffering he'd seen.
And that brings us to the most famous chapter of his life. This is where the medical student Ernesto Guevara truly becomes Che, the guerrilla commander of the Cuban Revolution.
The spark that really lit the fuse happened in Mexico City. He met two brothers who were in exile, Fidel and Raul Castro. They had a plan: overthrow Cuba's US-backed dictator, a guy named Fulgencio Batista. Che was so inspired by their vision that he signed on immediately, not just as their doctor, but as a soldier.
Okay, so their first attempt to invade Cuba was a complete and utter disaster. I mean, of the 82 rebels who landed, almost all of them were killed or captured. But Che, Fidel, and a few others managed to escape into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. And it was here that Che's strategic genius really shone through. He knew they couldn't win with just brute force. The real key? Win over the local peasants. They did it by building schools and clinics, by helping them, and all the while they were training a small, disciplined force in guerrilla tactics.
And you can just see how well this worked. I mean, look at this growth. They went from a tiny group of survivors to a rebel army of over 800 fighters. The local people didn't see them as invaders, they saw them as liberators who were bringing education and healthcare. They earned their trust, and you know what? That trust became their single greatest weapon.
So, after 2 long years of fighting this guerrilla war, Batista's regime finally crumbled. On January 1st, 1959, Castro's forces marched into Havana. The revolution had won, and Che Guevara, the doctor from Argentina, was now the second in command of Cuba. But as they say, winning a war is one thing, actually governing is a whole different ballgame.
And this is where the story takes a much, much darker turn, because with victory comes power. And Che's idealism was about to be tested by the brutal reality of holding on to that power and building a new state from the ground up.
Che was made the commander of the infamous La Cabaña prison, and his new job was basically to purge anyone and everyone tied to the old regime: policemen, politicians, anyone even suspected of being a counter-revolutionary. The trials were fast, the evidence was often flimsy, and the sentence was almost always death. Che was the one with the final authority, and he really didn't hesitate to order executions, often on suspicion alone.
Now, as a government official, Che did enact some sweeping reforms. He created land reform programs, nationalized major industries, and he led this amazing literacy campaign that was unbelievably successful. It raised the national literacy rate from around 60% to 96%. But, and this is a huge but, at the very same time, he was the guy building a system that crushed all dissent and established Cuba's first forced labor camps.
So how did he justify this? Well, it all came down to his core belief in creating what he called the new man. Che imagined this perfect society free of selfishness, where every single person worked only for the collective good. It's a noble idea, right? But in practice, anyone who didn't fit that mold, dissidents, priests, anyone considered unfit, was sent off to labor camps for a very brutal kind of re-education.
But here's the thing about Che. The revolution was never going to be just about Cuba for him. A comfortable life as a government minister? That just wasn't who he was. That revolutionary fire was still burning, and he truly believed his purpose was to spread that fire all across the world.
So, in 1965, he basically vanished from public life in Cuba. First, he went to the Congo to try and start a revolution, but it failed miserably. The local forces were just too disorganized. But he wasn't deterred. He turned his sights back to Latin America, sneaking into Bolivia in 1966 to start all over again.
But this wasn't Cuba. He couldn't recreate that magic from the Sierra Maestra. The Bolivian peasants were wary of him, and the Bolivian army, which was being trained and supplied by the CIA, was a lot more competent than Batista's had been. After months on the run, his little group was finally cornered. A local informant gave up his location, and on October 8th, an injured, exhausted Che Guevara was captured. His execution the very next day was supposed to be the end of Che Guevara, but instead, it was the beginning of the myth. His death transformed him from a failed guerrilla fighter into this timeless, global symbol of rebellion.
And that brings us right back to where we started. You see, there are really two Ches. There's the symbol, the romantic idea of the forever rebel fighting against injustice. And then there's the reality of the man, the strict ideologue, the state executioner, the guy who truly believed that the ends justified any means, no matter how brutal those means were.
So we're left with this really big question. Why has that romantic image on the t-shirt stuck around so powerfully, often completely separate from the much more complicated and violent history of the actual man? And what does it say about us that we seem to be so drawn to the myth of the rebel while we so often choose to forget the reality of the ruler? It's definitely something worth thinking about.